It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
The Psycho series. I've talked about it a bit before. I covered the original 1960 classic during the first Monster Madness in a brief and spoiler-free fashion, but now I think it's time to breeze through the whole series, giving my opinions for each one. I'm not talking about the TV film Bates Motel or the TV series of the same name, just the 4 films starring Anthony Perkins. So there's going to be spoilers. As you probably know, Psycho was directed by Alfred Hitchcock and is considered among his best work. It predated the slasher genre and brought us face to face with a type of killer that was way ahead of its time. If you've never seen Psycho, just forget the review and watch the movie. There's a lot to be said about this film. I guess the obvious is how it takes so many twists. The star, Janet Leigh, is killed off early in the movie, which was something unheard of back then. Even though I love this movie, I want to share with you a little secret. The first time I saw it, to be honest, I didn't like being thrown off like that. Once Janet Leigh, Marion Crane, was out of the picture, there was no main character. There was nothing to hold on to except for the money that she stole earlier. The money becomes the main focus, but then Norman Bates, while he's cleaning up the murder scene, presumably done by his mother, he accidentally throws the money away because it's hidden in a rolled up newspaper. He doesn't even know it's there. So think about how funny that is. It's like a joke on the audience. You think that money's going to be important? Nope. There it goes. And just when you think maybe Norman still has a chance to find it, he puts it in a car along with Marion's corpse and sinks it in the swamp. The first time I saw that, you might not want to believe, but I changed the channel. Yeah, the movie lost me. That was the point where I just thought, okay, I'm done with this. Now I'm kicking myself in the ass for that, but what's really strange, somehow I ended up switching the channel back just in time for the final scene, and I was pretty confused. Norman's mother is a skeleton, Norman's wearing a wig, there's another woman who looks similar to Janet Leigh. What's going on here? So time passes by, and I keep hearing this movie's such a masterpiece, so I rented it probably when I was about 15. I watched it all the way through and loved it. Sometimes it just depends on your mood, but it's kind of interesting how I spoiled the ending for myself and still found myself in suspense as the story unfolded and took so many turns. The money really has nothing to do with anything. In the grand picture, it's all about Norman and his mother, but the money is what gets the plot started. It's something the characters care about, but it's insignificant compared to all the other stuff that happens. The money, or whatever object it is in these movies, Hitchcock called the MacGuffin. The money is what gets Marion to hit the road and to stay at the Bates Motel, to meet Norman Bates, and that's where the film really starts. After Marion's killed, her boyfriend, Sam Loomis, the same character name as the doctor in Halloween, comes to find her along with Marion's sister, Lila. Things get tense when they suspect Norman of killing her, and the funny thing is that they're right, but not for the reason they think. They think he wanted her money, which would have made perfect sense, but Hitchcock chose to show us what really went down. We feel like the all-observing eye. We know that Norman had no clue the money was even there, and it drives us nuts. The scene when Sam is interrogating Norman in his office, it made me feel frustrated. I wanted to jump into the movie and say, hey, that's not what happened. However, as an alternative, it's interesting to watch the movie after Norman hides Marion's corpse. So if you start it just as Sam and Lila begin investigating her disappearance, that way you can view it as a mystery which unfolds. And it's just another interesting way to look at it. Of course, Norman's played by Anthony Perkins. Fantastic performance. It never seems like he's acting. He's just being Norman. He seems like a kind, genuine, down-to-earth guy who's probably real lonely, but then he turns out to be a total lunatic. So most of the slasher films that followed had their killers masked and without speaking a single line. This was different. You get to know Norman closely, making him so much more complex. So at first you're thinking the mother is the killer, but at the end when you realize it's Norman, The mother's dead and Norman thinks he's the mother. It was such a mind-blowing concept back then in 1960. They had to have a psychologist come in at the last scene and explain it all. Nowadays, I think that scene is unnecessary. I think modern audiences would get the idea Norman had a split personality disorder. So if this movie has one weakness, I'd say it's that last scene. You could lose it. Now, let's talk about Psycho 2. You would think it would be bad. Those were my assumptions. It was released only a few years after Hitchcock died. It would seem to me that was disrespectful. I would bet he'd never approve the idea of a sequel. There's a 23-year gap since the original. They filmed it in color, and it seemed like a cheap way to cash in on the newly popular slasher genre, which the original Psycho was a precursor to. Now it would fall into the very same cliches, ripping off the rip-offs of itself. To add insult to injury, the author of the original novel, Robert Bloch, actually wrote a book of Psycho 2 before the movie, which was unrelated. It was a satire of Hollywood and made fun of the slasher genre. Apparently the studio hated the book, so they had their own script written, which was completely different. So the point is, this whole thing seemed like it would be a disaster. But holy shit, it's actually a good psychological film, thanks in most part to Anthony Perkins. In the 23 years since the original, he seems to have grown into the role and understands the character more than ever. The plot goes like this. Norman's released from the asylum, giving more reason for the 23-year gap. Now he's declared sane again and ready to start a normal life. He reopens the motel, gets a job at a diner, and he has a lot of trouble adjusting back into society. Everybody gives him a hard time, calling him a psycho and whatever, so you feel for Norman. You want him to have a second chance. Even though he fooled us once, the first time around, he now seems like he's moved on from his past and is not the same person as he was before. But people keep pushing him, and it gets even worse when Lila returns. She obviously can't forget her sister was murdered, and she's willing to do anything to get Norman locked up again, even if it means framing him. So she goes through all this effort to trick him into thinking his mother's still alive to deliberately set him off again. And as things progress, you start to wonder, is Norman really losing it again, or what's happening? So you get to watch his sanity decline all over again and go on that psychological roller coaster ride, experiencing all the suspense and twists that you'd hope for. It doesn't match the original, but it's still a surprisingly worthy sequel. Psycho 3. This one has its fans, but in my opinion, it was completely unnecessary. Psycho 2 actually felt like an important chapter and brought Norman full circle. I think they could have left it alone and that would have been a perfect ending, but then they got greedy and couldn't wait any more than 3 years before shitting out another sequel. People waited 23 years for Psycho 2. There's no reason they had to make another one so soon. Psycho 3 blends in with all the other slasher films of the time. It's nothing special except for the fact that it has the familiar face of Anthony Perkins, who even directed this one. His acting is still just as good, but he can only do so much with a mediocre script. The plot is generic. Norman starts out just as insane as he ever was. There's no surprises or suspense. Guests arrive at his motel. First, a rock star wannabe named Dwayne Duke, played by Jeff Fahey. Norman gives him a job at the motel. Then he's visited by a suicidal nun who reminds him of Marion Crane, coincidentally having the same initials. It leads to a false repeat of the shower scene, making reference to all the tropes that the original started. Then there's a journalist who's trying to do a story about Norman, and then, I don't know, it just boils down to Norman killing people. I can't really summarize it all because the plot doesn't really have a clear thread like the other ones do. You just have to talk about every little scene. Like the lampshade sex scene. I don't know what that's about. There's just weird, random shit in this movie. There's some subtle moments I like. For example, when Norman finds a dead bird outside and brings it in to stuff it for his taxidermy collection. Then there's the part where the cop is casually eating ice out of the ice box, but there's body parts in there. The cop never notices, but Norman's watching him with that weird look that only Anthony Perkins can do. So I like parts like those. The ultimate highlight, for better or worse, is when Norman fights Dwayne in the motel room. I never knew what to make of this scene. Dwayne has now gone full psycho as well, antagonizing Norman with his mom's corpse. I don't think we needed two psychos. It kind of steals the thunder away from Norman. The whole scene is dimly lit with weird colors and ends with Norman bashing Dwayne repeatedly with his guitar while Woody Woodpecker plays on the TV. What the hell? I kind of enjoy how surreal this scene is, and that's how I feel about most of this film. I can still enjoy it as just being a weird 80s slasher film, but it adds nothing important to the story of Norman Bates. I've watched it several times and it never grows on me, still residing somewhere in watchable territory, but far, far below the first two movies. Like I said, it has its fans and there must be something there to appreciate, but I just don't see anything more than what I already mentioned. Psycho 4 was made for TV in 1990, 30 years now after the original, and again coinciding with the release of another Robert Bloch book, Psycho House, which was again ignored. I would have expected this film to be the bottom of the barrel, but it actually does have some purpose, elaborating on Norman's childhood, taking place in the past, as well as the present. It gives you the backstory, but also moves the story forward, giving it a fitting end. It begins with Norman calling into a radio station to talk about his life story, and I really like the way they reveal him in this movie. When he's in the kitchen with the phone, and he's got his back turned, and then he says, like, you want to know about mother, or whatever he says, like, I'll tell you something about mothers. And this whole idea of calling into the radio station may sound like a dumb concept, but you have Anthony Perkins narrating, and he sounds so committed to what he's telling. His voice serves as a memoir for his character and a final farewell. He tells of all his experiences with his mother as a child, and it's more disturbing than you'd imagine. I mean, he even has like this weird, almost sexual relationship with his mother. I mean, this movie isn't afraid to go there. You might think it's unnecessary to reveal too much about Norman's past, but I think it pays off. It does it in a very fast-paced, efficient way. It jumps to all the most important events strung together with Norman's narration. So it keeps momentum. And in other situations, this might have been sloppy or might not have given enough time for the scenes to breathe. But Anthony Perkins holds it all together. So it's kind of like this, like almost cliff notes of Norman's life. So Anthony Perkins is totally in command here. So I think this was another surprisingly welcome addition to the Psycho franchise. It expands on the lore, it gives us more insight into Norman, and is thoroughly entertaining. Honestly, I think there's something in all of them. I think it's worth watching the whole series. And if I were to rank them, I'd put the original way up on a pedestal with Psycho 2 underneath, then Psycho 4, and then way below all of them I'd put Psycho 3. Though, none of them are dull.